I recently had the good fortune to enjoy a Zoom conversation with the author, Dr. Bradley Harper. Bradley is a retired US Army colonel and pathologist, experienced in autopsies and forensic investigation. Having spent 37 years in the US Army, Bradley retired and decided to put his experience to good use by writing a novel. That novel is A Knife in the Fog, and Bradley and I discussed it from opposite sides of the pond. This is our conversation. So, what should we chat about your book then? So that's what I wanted to chat about.
Well, you'll never have a difficult time getting an author to chat about his book. It's like having us talk about our child. I've bragged about yours quite a bit. I've told many people that your book was the inspiration for mine.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I've got your book here, so I'm going to hold it up. I'm going to hold it up to the camera. So, Knife in the Fog by Bradley Harper.
What a kind chap you are.
And I'm joined by Bradley now. So Bradley, first of all, the book, Knife in the Fog. It's an interesting premise because there's been lots of films, haven't there, about Jack the Ripper being pursued by Sherlock Holmes. But you take a slightly different tact, and you have Holmes's creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or Arthur Conan Doyle as he was at the time, 29 years old, pursuing history's most infamous serial killer, Jack the Ripper. So is that a fair surmise of the book?
I'd say that's exactly it. What inspired me to try my hand at this was I've always been a huge fan of Sherlock Holmes. The summer I turned 13, I read the entire canon in one large gulp over about 3.5 weeks, and I cried when the last story had ended because it was the last one. And so I've always been a huge fan of that. After I retired from the military as a pathologist, I was one day reading on Wikipedia a little bit about Conan Doyle, and I saw that there was a 4-year gap from when he wrote the first Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet, and the second story, the Sign of Four. And so it was 86 was the first book, or the first story, then 1890 was the next. And right in the middle, 1888 was when the Ripper murders happened. The Ripper suddenly began, suddenly stopped, no one knows why. And Doyle only got 25 pounds for A Study in Scarlet and had to surrender full copyright. So he was so soured by that experience, he said he would never write another crime story again. So he turned to historical fiction and said, that's the end of that. And fortunately, in 1890, there was a meeting with an American magazine publisher. He summoned both Doyle and Oscar Wilde to have dinner with him in a hotel restaurant there in London. And so he offered each of them 100 pounds if they write something for his magazine. So Oscar Wilde agreed to write, or his inspiration, he wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Conan Doyle returned to writing Sherlock Holmes. So I cannot imagine a more profitable dinner in my life.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because they are two writers you wouldn't associate with each other. But they were great admirers of each other, weren't they? Oscar Wilde and Conan Doyle. And you wouldn't think that. As I say, you get this image of Conan Doyle as being this cricket-playing, sporting, sort of, he's been on board the whaling ships, he's done everything. And then you get Oscar Wilde completely opposite. And yet, they were great respect. I mean, Conan Doyle had a great respect for Oscar Wilde, didn't he?
He certainly did. And Wilde returned the compliment. He was most complimentary on Doyle's writing, both Holmes and his other historical fiction as well. So they were, in fact, great admirers of each other. Anyway, so it comes 1888. Doyle has, forsaken crime writing. He's back to writing Micah Clarke about the English Civil War. And so I had him get a summons from the former Prime Minister Gladstone. As we all know, Gladstone was quite sympathetic to the plight of the fallen women of London. And in fact, he got a lot of criticism about that. We're inviting him to come to London to see if he can't help to find this man who's murdering these fallen women. I recently learned the American Southern expression of the 19th century for a fallen woman was a soiled dove.
Oh, so It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Well, I mean, Gladstone gets a bad rap for this because I mean, one of the things that's happened to him because of that is that he's actually been accused of being Jack the Ripper because of his involvement with the fallen women of Whitechapel. But in fact, he was very sympathetic towards them. His point was that he wanted to get women back off the streets who didn't want to be on the streets, or those who'd been forced into prostitution. And I think he often gets misportrayed by people for that. But it was a genuine philanthropic modus operandi to it, wasn't it? That he wanted to do that. But so I think, as I say, he does get a bad rap. He gets a good rap in your book. I love the way that Conan Doyle gets the summons to London, and it's all done very mysteriously, and they go to the Marlborough Club, and he doesn't know who this mysterious patron is at first, and then insists on Joseph Bell. Joseph Bell, I mean, he's also involved, isn't he? And he's the man who was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes. So did you think you had to have him involved in Knife in the Fog?
Oh, definitely so. Doyle in real life did do some detective work. He cleared an Anglo-Indian barrister of animal mutilation and a German Jew who was falsely imprisoned for homicide in later years. But at this time in his life, he was still very much a novice writer, still struggling as a general practitioner in medicine. He was thinking about becoming an eye surgeon. So his path in life was still very much in flux. And Bell was the mentor as his professor of surgery. And I thought that using him as a mentor at trying his hand at detective work would be a natural role for him to play. Now, in the book, at one point, I have Bell perform handwriting analysis of some of the notes that were signed Jack the Ripper. And about a year after I wrote that in the story, I found out he actually did that.
That he had actually
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Bell did take an interest because I mean, Bell was interested in all sorts of things. I came across an interview that he gave to the Pall Mall Gazette in, I think it was 1892, and he was talking about how he took an interest in crime. And he was asked, were you asked to go and solve the Jack the Ripper crime? And he hinted that he had been involved with it, but he didn't go any further than that. So yeah, I think it's not nice to have the Bell. And of course, there's a third author who you involve as well, and it's an author that, I mean, people will all know Conan Doyle. Many will probably know that it was based on Joseph Bell, but there's a female author that you include, and I think that's she's probably somebody that a lot of people won't know about today. Would you like to elucidate on who she was?
Certainly, and I have you to thank for that. You mentioned in your book about Jack the Ripper that Margaret Harkness, who is a suffragette and a Christian socialist and a campaigner for women's rights, and that she was living in the Whitechapel area during the Ripper murders because she wrote about the working poor of London, and that she wanted to live as her characters did so she could more accurately portray her characters' lives. And so, yes, she is, I think in large part, the book is as much about Margaret as it is about Jack the Ripper. And we get to meet her and most of the things I say about her were true. And after I wrote the book, I realized that what I'd done because the three of them joined together to help take on Jack the Ripper, and they start calling themselves the Three Musketeers.
I love that bit. I love. And
So anyway, after I finished the book, I wish I had been this clever at the beginning, but once I'd finished it and it was sold and was going into publication, I realized what I had done is with those three characters, I've written three different aspects of the human personality. Doyle is ego. The peas can't touch the carrots. He's a perfect middle class British gentleman of the Victorian era, and everything has to be just right at all times. Bell is the superego. He understands the need for rules, but he can also stand back sometimes and see the larger picture. And for Sherlock Holmes did that a lot. He would have his own brand of justice, which was extra legal, but I think in many aspects was more fair, more just than what the legal profession could have enacted. And then Margaret, bless her, is pure id. She says what she thinks as soon as she thinks it. And she's the sort of person we all wish we could become, but generally that requires 2 or 3 stiff drinks to get to Margaret's level.
I mean, I get the impression in the book that Conan Doyle in the book is somewhat intimidated by her. I mean, I'm getting the right. Am I getting the right impression there?
Certainly so. She is unlike any woman he's ever met in his life, and unlike many men he's probably met as well. She is very brash.
She scolds him quite a lot.
She does. She does. She's not impressed with him at all at first, and only a little bit more by the end. But no, she's ready to face the world on its terms, and is not going to shrink away.
Yeah. And of course, her book Out of Work had come out in August 1888, the year of the Jack the Ripper murders. So that was when her book came out, and of course that highlighted the infamous episode of the previous year, November, the Bloody Sunday riots. She was very involved, not very involved, but she certainly, because being a socialist, she was involved with the likes of John Burns and people like this. And she did. You have to take your hat off to these wonderful ladies like Margaret Harkness, who went and lived in the East End of London. They lived amongst the people that they were serving, and they would live in tenements. And it was, if you think about it, it's just such a wonderful thing to actually do that and to have that devotion to that class of people. So yeah, she's a formidable woman, and I think in Knife in the Fog, she certainly does come across as incredibly formidable. And in fact, I think there's times in there where I was quaking at her as well.
Thank you very much. You know, just before I have Doyle meet her, she had just helped organize the Match Girls strike in 1888, the summer of 1888. And unfortunately, that was unsuccessful. And so she's still licking her wounds from that. And in the book, I have her wearing men's clothing oftentimes. And part of that is to escape the thugs hired by the match factory owners who are trying to get revenge on her for causing such a disruption to their production.
Yep. There's a wonderful, there's a statue, if you go down to the Mile End Road or down towards Bow Church, there's a statue of William Ewart Gladstone there. And his hands are often painted red. And it's a local thing. It started, I think it started about 20, 30 years ago. But people go and paint his hands red because that statue was paid for by one of the Bryants of Bryant and May the match manufacturers of Bow East London. And the rumour was that it had been paid for by stopping a day's wages or stopping money from the girls' pay packets who worked in the match factory. And so consequently, there's this wonderful story that whenever this council cleans the red paint off the hands, it always comes back overnight or over the next week or so. It would come back. It's completely untrue that they were stopped any pay to pay for the statue, but it's a wonderful story. And this statue just stands there on an island going towards the busy Stratford intersection. And as you drive down past it, you just see these red hands on the statue. But it's a big thing, the Match Girls strike, and it's one of the first major trade union strikes when workers started to demand their own rights. And it was the likes of Margaret Harkness who started that. So I thought it's just a wonderful idea to have her involved with Conan Doyle and Joseph Bell and employed on behalf of, well, actually, I don't want to go giving the story away, but employed on behalf of you-know-who to try and catch the most infamous serial killer in the East End of London.
Yeah, I make mention, in fact, that because by this time the telegraph was ubiquitous. It was probably the first serial killer whose misdeeds were being followed almost in real time around the world.
Well, that's it exactly. And the beauty of it is that we can, even today, we can look back on those newspapers. We've got all the old newspaper articles, and we can literally see not just the investigation, but the life in the East End of London. And of course, you get these, if you dig deep enough, Margaret Harkness pops up, but also all the other philanthropists pop up as well. And it really is, I mean, to me, that's one of the interests of Jack the Ripper, that you're actually looking into. Almost this reportage of it is a window back into the East End of London in 1888, and it uncovers everything. But that was the interesting thing about your book, because of course if I deduce correctly, you're not from London. So, so, so
God gave it away.
I don't know. I'm very intelligent in that respect. I'm a Conan Doyle, a Sherlock Holmes when it comes to detecting accents. So, did you find it difficult, sort of writing about London from so far away?
It did and it didn't. The thing I was most afraid of was, would I be able to capture the voice of Conan Doyle? I was very concerned about that because I've lost it now, but I grew up in Oklahoma in the middle of the United States, and it's a long walk to the beach. And the first time I went across the pond I was in my 20s, and then I was in Turkey. So I didn't make it to England itself until I was. That being said, because I ingested the entire Sherlock Holmes canon at that formative age, it's like Doyle's voice, the DNA was embedded in my head. And my minister, fortunately here in the States, is originally from the UK. And he was my first beta reader. And I said, I don't want you to comment on the story itself, just the voice. Am I convincingly sounding like Conan Doyle? And he was I'm sorry, I got to turn the fan on, a little bit warm. And he was most reassuring that part I had right. I recently got a very nice review from the editor for the Daily Messenger, which is the newsletter for the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. Now, the lady who does that is originally from the States. So she was somewhat kind, but she did point out 2 or 3 errors I made. For example, at one point I have Doyle mention not taking his pants off. They're going to spend the night in the police station. And of course, she rapped my knuckles and said, "You should have said trousers." Pants refers to undergarments, apparently. And 2 or 3 other things I got wrong. But she said overall, for a Yank, I wasn't too bad.
High praise indeed. High praise indeed. So but I was also very intrigued as well by the fact you sent Conan Doyle to Clubland, so Gentleman's Clubland. He goes to stay at a club in Pall Mall, the Marlborough Club, which I believe is 52 Pall Mall that you have him at. And I was very intrigued by he gets the summons to come to London, and he goes to this club, and he puts up at the club in Gentleman's Clubland. And I thought that was a really interesting stroke because, of course, Pall Mall and the gentlemen's clubs, it's often referred to as the last bastion of male chauvinism left in the country. And so to have Conan Doyle putting up in this area and then meeting that sort of suffragette, the feminist Margaret Harkness, I thought that was wonderful. Because one of the big things with Margaret Harkness was that she actually wrote under a pseudonym, that she wrote as John Law. So even though she was this great icon, she still had to sort of adopt this male persona and so it just shows how at odds everything was at the time. But no, I thought it was a wonderful idea to include the 3 of them. And how did you go about your research when you decided you were going to go to Gentleman's Clubland? Did you go and sort of stay at a club or visit a club, or did you just conjure up how you thought the club should be?
Well, I'm quite fortunate. Being a retired military, when I was stationed in Germany, I was able to stay at the oh my goodness, getting old, at a British club in London that allowed officers in Allied countries to stay. And since I retired from the military, the Union Jack Club, and then across from Victoria Station, if I remember correctly. And since I've retired, I've joined the Victory Services Club. So whenever I go to London, I always stay there in my club, if you will. And although it's not a Victorian club, still there's some of that flavor of, this is where you belong. And that I just love that. In every story, you've got to have peaks and valleys and, moments of great suspense, but then you have to give the reader a little break. So at one point I have Bell off doing some research, talking to his colleagues in the hospitals and insane asylums in London. And Doyle has some time on his own. So he goes back to the club and he's rhapsodizing about, I can take a nap. I can talk to someone. I can go to the bar. I can have a meal. I can go to my room. I can read all these papers and just, one by I have him say, if one could choose one's version of the afterlife, a heavenly version of the Marlboro Club would probably be his first choice.
And of course, this is the other point that I forgot to mention earlier. You just reminded me of something there, because of course you're writing about two famous doctors, Conan Doyle and Joseph Bell. Joseph Bell very much. It was best explained to me by a surgeon in Edinburgh when I was talking to him about Bell, and he pointed out to me. He said, "Well, the thing we forget today is that we've got all sorts of things. We've got X-rays and scans we can do today, but in those days." You didn't. You really had to follow the clues and judge things. Now, of course, what that reminded me when you just mentioned that was, of course, you have a medical background, and you, it was my understanding, if I remember correctly, that it was a chance encounter that got you that medical background, because you were going to be a history teacher. Was that a history teacher or English teacher?
History and Spanish, actually.
History teacher.
Due to a small country called Vietnam, I had a period of mandatory military service, and so I was in the infantry. I used to jump out of perfectly good airplanes, and then one day I had to go on sick call, and the doctor I saw was so incompetent that I came home and told my wife, says, if that guy can make it through medical school, I think I can. And so I proved myself right, and came back in the service with the intention from the beginning to be a military doctor, thinking that I thought that my soldiers deserved better care than what this guy was doing, and wound up doing 37 years of active duty altogether.
And you was a forensic pathologist? Did I?
Well, no, I am a pathologist. I did do some forensic cases in the military because you could be stationed all over it. And when I was in Heidelberg, I was the only pathologist there. The hospital wasn't large enough to need two, and so I would do some forensic cases there. Now, if it was like a car accident, suicides, motor training accidents, that sort of thing, anything that might go to court ordinarily would go to a forensic trained specialist in Landstuhl. There was one case I was involved in that did go to trial, but there was mixed jurisdiction, and I don't want to go into too many details. But the primary pathologist was a German pathologist, and they took jurisdiction over part of the case, and another case involved the U.S. serviceman. And so I assisted him, and my report then was used to prosecute the American serviceman.
And I read that you have performed, in your career, you performed over 200 autopsies.
Correct.
Was that correct, sir? So what I'm getting at here, I'm sure you can guess where I'm going with this one, because of that medical background, performing autopsies, etc., then you're in a perfect position to answer the big question about Jack the Ripper, and that is, did he demonstrate medical knowledge?
He did indeed. I think I was very impressed with the murder of Mrs. Eddowes in Mitre Square, where in a very short period of time, in almost complete darkness, he was able to perform a hysterectomy after slitting her throat without nicking the bladder or the other viscera, to take it cleanly out. That showed total confidence, total faith in his knowledge of what he was looking for, how to access it, and what the adjacent structures were, so he could do a nice, I won't say nice, but a very efficient job of removing that organ under, I'm sure, a lot of pressure and almost total darkness. So yes, so that showed quite a bit of knowledge of human anatomy.
So do you think that because this was the big issue with Jack the Ripper, there was a lot of talk about it at the time at the inquests, when some doctors said that he demonstrated surgical. Of course, the other thing we have to say is, was it surgical knowledge or anatomical knowledge? I.e., was it the knowledge knowing where the organs were? And of course, the surgical knowledge being the ability to remove the organs. Do you think he showed both, or do you think he showed just one of them?
I would say anatomic. To demonstrate surgical skill, I would have to, then I think of, making an incision, removing something. A skilled butcher can do that. Closing the wound back up and maintaining the proper tension, the body is put together a certain way, and when you take something out, there's stress on different tissues and organs, and to be able to reapproximate that wound efficiently and well, so that things are in their proper situation, that to me would then demonstrate surgical skill. And he never closed the wounds, he left them open. And so I can't say for certain that he had surgical skill, but he certainly had, he was very strong in his knowledge of human anatomy.
And do you think a lot of the doctors at the time were adamant at the inquests that there's no anatomical knowledge, doesn't show any anatomical. It could have been a horse slaughterer or a butcher. Do you think there's a sort of element of, don't blame us, Gov, don't pick on the doctors, we couldn't have done such a thing, or do you think genuinely that they believed that he just demonstrated the knowledge of a butcher or a horse slaughterer?
The anatomy is different with different species, and being able to do a hysterectomy from a dog is quite different, or from knowing where a uterus is in a horse is not the same as it is in a human being. So no, I'd say his knowledge was very specific for the human body. I can understand the physicians wanting to poo-poo that, cause distrust of them as they make their rounds. But I'm reminded, for the same reason, a lot of British people were saying that, well, Jack the Ripper could not be an Englishman, because no Englishman would be capable of such brutality. Forgetting the time, of course, when heads used to adorn London Bridge.
We're very good at forgetting sort of some of the things we've done. It astonishes me that people actually want to come back here. We've been that horrible to people. And going back to Conan, because what I did like about it was, because of course, being an author lives in their character. You have to take on your character. You become your character, and I think you do that very well with Conan Doyle. What did it feel? I mean, you must have trying to get yourself into his mindset and his mentality. How did that feel?
It was intimidating and partly because, he is such a giant in the what I said, okay, who am I taking on? He's still a young man, relatively young at 29. He's yet to make his mark upon the world. But of course, he's writing this now as a memoir, very late in life. And so I think I wanted to show this is the promise, this is the beginning of a great career of a man who was imperfect, stumbled, but who was always seeking truth. To be a good writer, you can lie, but there has to be truth within that lie. The Holmes stories are true to human nature. If they weren't, then they couldn't hold our interest. So Doyle was a man who was seeking his own way in life and seeking how to find his truth and how to express it, and putting myself in that younger version of him, and then thinking, okay, now I'm an old man. I'm thinking of my youth and the stumbles I had, my great adventure, and trying to see him as a human being and to put his greatness to one side. That allowed me to take on that role. Otherwise, it would have been just too much.
When we get Conan Doyle, one thing about Conan Doyle, I suppose a lot of people don't really know or don't realize about him, was he came from a very, very harsh background. His father was an alcoholic who'd ended up in an asylum. His father was a fantastic artist. But he, as I say, he ended up as an alcoholic going into the asylum. So Conan Doyle didn't have an easy childhood, did he? He was and I think that gave him the ability to be very much on the side of the underdog. And I've known you for some years now, and that's one thing that comes across to me about you as well, that you do a lot of volunteering, you do a lot of work for other people, and of course being from a medical background. So do you see a bit of yourself or vice versa in Conan Doyle?
Oh, that's a huge compliment. Thank you very much. One of the things about Doyle was he was able to give, like Margaret, in a way, he was able to give a common man a voice, a face, to make them a living, breathing breathing character that we, the reader, care about. Um, the story about the man who loses, who gets a goose and finds a great jewel within, that
Blue Carbuncle.
yes, thank you, that beautiful Christmas story. These are all just very poor, common people that he's very sympathetic towards, and so that was the thing I tried to do in the story when he's first out. A lot of people, they say there's no saint like an old sinner. He had by now escaped poverty. He was now becoming a comfortable middle class British gentleman. And so sometimes people want to forget where they came from, to deny that. And so I wanted to show him trying to blank out or to ignore the lower classes and look more to the middle and the upper class, the people he was aspiring to become, to emulate. And in the story, Margaret very much shoves his nose back into, these are real people too. You should care about them as much as anyone else. In fact, at one point, I have them visit Mary Kelly, to Doyle's great embarrassment. And but again, I didn't want the victims of the Ripper to be props to this horrible person, but to have the reader care about them and see them as human beings, and not just a name or one more count on the wall for his total count of people that he murdered. He did terrible things, and I wanted people to understand that these were horrendous crimes, and for the reader to care about that.
I think that does come across very much, and I think the other thing about the Ripper murders, or Jack the Ripper, is of course that Jack the Ripper never actually existed. there was no serial killer called Jack the Ripper. He was the Whitechapel murderer, whoever he may have been. And of course, Jack the Ripper came from the famous letter that was sent to the news agency, which was the Dear Boss letter, signed Jack the Ripper. But of course, it did involve society as a whole. And of course, a lot of the politicians of the age got involved with it. And of course, it confronted the police with something that they really couldn't cope with. I think they did their best. But of course, the officer who you bring in is perhaps the most famous one, and that's Frederick Aberline. So Aberline, what was your opinion of Aberline when you started writing?
Well, I was very impressed with him. I think he was. He had finished his tour at the Commercial Street Station in recognition of his sterling service. He was elevated to Scotland Yard, and then in a short time later is brought back to the Commercial Street Station because I said, he knows the criminal underworld there better than anyone else, and they felt that he was the man most qualified to lead the search on the ground. And I think he was a very wise, experienced police officer who was doing the best that he possibly could. Having done some forensics myself, I was able to point out in the story some mistakes that were made, that particularly the bodies would be washed and the clothes discarded before the police surgeon was able to make his investigation. Maybe so there were some clues there that were lost. These were the first murders that photographs were used to document what the wounds were, the position of the body, that sort of thing. And there was no standardization at that time. They hired commercial photographers, and each had their own idea how this should be done. So there's no standardization yet. Of course, fingerprints didn't come along until around 1901, is when Scotland Yard finally started using fingerprints. So there was a lot of things which I think, just because that was the standard of the time, forensic science was still had yet to come into being as a discipline. In fact, a talk I give is called Sherlock Holmes as Science Fiction, and I talk about a French physician, Edmond Locard, who founded the world's first crime lab in 1910, and he took the Sherlock Holmes stories to heart and said, these techniques that are described could be used in real life. And so the fiction over time became fact, and the Holmes character inspired that reality.
And it was what's interesting about Aberline's involved. I get the impression that at first Aberline isn't too impressed with these amateurs coming in onto his patch, as it was, or his manor.
I think that's very fair. I think he was sort of like the captain of the ship. You know, this is my area of London. I'm responsible for this. And in real life, just shortly before I introduced them to the story, a director of the Bank of England was caught loitering about, dressed as very shabby clothes. He was playing detective, trying to catch Jack the Ripper. Also in real life, a newspaper journalist disguised himself as a woman, hoping to have an interview with the Whitechapel murderer. And I have Aberline comment that if that had happened, the interview would have been one-sided and brief.
Well, and of course, the amateur detectives do feature to an extent. One of the lovely quotes that I got from you, I have from your book. I've actually marked it here. When Conan Doyle confronts one of the amateur detectives and pursues him.
Oh yes.
And then he pins him down to explain himself. And there's that wonderful you've got. I actually can't find the quote offhand, but basically what you have him, or Conan Doyle observes that an honest man, if you ask an honest man a question, he will answer it straightforward. Whereas words to the effect, when you ask the honest man a question, he'll answer it in a straightforward manner. But if a man is lying, he has to think about his answer. I got that one correct?
Yes, you did. You certainly did. Yeah, there were two detectives, Batchelor and Grant, I believe it was. They were hired by the Star newspaper, among others, to do their own investigations, trying in the Ripper investigations. And there was the famous grape vendor who supposedly sold a bunch of grapes to a suspicious man, and I believe it was Liz Stride, just outside the Working Man's Club shortly before her body was found. And so they were very proud that they found a grape stalk by a gutter nearby. And I have Doyle comment, says, "Good job, you proved the people in the East End eat grapes."
That's it. That's the Matthew Packer who's got the store, and he said he sold grapes to them. And funnily enough, he keeps turning up every so often in the investigation, and he seems to have been one of those people who forever wants to get involved. And he turns up again in the late after the Francis Coles murder of 1891.
I didn't know that.
So basically, he turns up to say he's being threatened by local gangs, that he's talked too much. So he's an interesting character. I think he's somebody that should be looked at more. Not for being Jack the Ripper, but certainly because there were so many hoaxes out there. I mean, obviously the Jack the Ripper letter was a hoax as well. But going back to the story though, because when you're writing from afar, because to me, I mean, living in London, I can picture, before lockdown, I could go and walk to any of these places, but when you're living in London, it's fun. But from so far, what sort of picture did you conjure up in your mind? I mean, did you get yourself into a mood by conjuring a picture of London? And were you there, obviously not physically, but mentally, were you there in the streets of London and Victorian London?
Very much so. When I read those Holmes stories back at 13, Conan Doyle cast a magic spell and created this alternate reality, this world, which is, I think, one poem I've read, talking about Holmes and Watson, two men who never live so they can never die. And so the London of Sherlock Holmes probably never really existed the way Doyle described it. But that world I know intimately well, and so I tried to conjure it up. And some of the descriptions you gave in your book about Jack the Ripper, I use about the slaughterhouse, the children running through the street, their barefoot, stained with the blood of horses that had recently been slaughtered, that sort of thing. And then I think there are two scenes I'm very proud of. One I'm not going to discuss because it would give the story away. But the other scene I'm very proud of, I did not get from your book, but I did get from your tour. And that's when we were walking And you were mentioning that when Mary Kelly's body was being removed, it coincided with the installation of the new Lord Mayor of London. And thousands of people left the ceremony in their Sunday best to stand outside the courtyard to watch the body of this poor woman being removed in a plain wooden box. And so the newspaper accounts at the time said that there was utter silence in the crowd as her body came out. And I don't know exactly how far away the installation was, but I don't think it was more than maybe a mile and a quarter away. They weren't that far apart. And so, at least in my version, there's total silence amongst the crowd, but far off they can hear the sounds of music and celebration. And I contrast the Lord Mayor in his ermine-lined robe and his chain of office with the scene going on at the courtyard. And I thought that was one of my most effective scenes.
It's and of course, yeah, and it wasn't that far away. I mean, we're talking probably in walking distance, maybe 10 to 15 minutes maximum, at a fairly relaxed pace. I mean, not at not tortoise speed, but certainly at a relaxed. So to the City of London. I mean, that was the other thing about the Ripper murders, is that they were on the doorstep of the wealthiest square mile on earth, and attracted all this attention to sort of one of the sordid little quarters outside the City of London. And there is a very famous painting, actually, of the Lord Mayor's show that was done on that day, of the Lord Mayor's show that day, which I believe is in Guildhall, the Guildhall or Guildhall Art Gallery. But either way, there's a painting of the Lord Mayor's show that day, and you can see the people gathered around the Mansion House. And of course, what it doesn't depict is the fact that Jack the Ripper's just gone and ruined the Lord Mayor's day for that particular day. And I think that's the interesting thing, that we've got this poverty and we've got this immense wealth, and they're virtually side by side. You know, and the city could smell the East End if the wind was blowing in the right direction. So, yeah, and I think that's a lovely thing about Knife in the Fog, is that you really do capture that mood. And one thing that struck me was you capture the going from the clubland of the West End of London, the immense wealth, and then suddenly you're in the East End of London. And of course, Margaret Harkness is their tour guide, isn't she? She when they go over there, she's their guide to take them around the Ripper's London.
Another thing that I found very interesting was Mrs. Eddowes was actually killed within the confines of the City of London, whereas the others were all under the purview of the Metropolitan Police. And I wrote of the between those two police departments. And I was able to sit in on a book club, where the book club was discussing my book. And one of the members is a retired police officer. And he said that was one of the things he enjoyed the most about the book, because he said in real life, he said the police departments of neighboring jurisdictions are constantly at odds with each other. So he said that was one of the most believable parts of the story.
Well, what I find interesting about the police, Mrs. Catherine Eddowes' murder in Mitre Square, of course, it happens in the City of London. And she was arrested for being drunk in the City of London. Now, had she actually been arrested in the Metropolitan Police area, she would have spent the night in prison. But the city authorities, their attitude was simply, look, if we've got someone who's drunk, we'll just, when they sober up, we'll release them. Whereas the Metropolitan Police, they would get them into court for being drunk the next day. And I think it's just, again, one of those many tragedies of Jack the Ripper, that had she been arrested just 3 streets across, then she probably would have survived, because she would have been in police custody at the time that the Ripper was coming from Berners Street. And so I think there's all these little bits of coincidence and tragedy that happen. And of course, that's the thing. It's that moment in life, isn't it, where you go one way and your entire life changes. And it's but going back to Conan Doyle, because one of the things that fascinates me about Conan Doyle is that famously Conan Doyle became famous with Sherlock Holmes, but very quickly grew to hate Sherlock Holmes and wanted to. Did you have a similar feeling towards Conan Doyle, or do you still love him?
I still love him very much. I tried my hand at it in my third novel. I tried a story about the theft of the Irish crown jewels, and going back and reuniting Margaret and Professor Bell. That's an interesting story. Very not well known in the States. I don't know if I won't go in great detail, but that's probably not why we're here. But just again, real life is so interesting. the gentleman in charge of the Irish Chronicles was a distant cousin of Conan Doyle's. And so I have Doyle, in fact, in real life, offered to come to Dublin to try to save his cousin's job. And of course, in my version, he does. So I was going to reunite Margaret and Belle with him. But no, I never grow tired of Doyle. He's a very interesting man. On one hand, he comes up with this very scientific detective, and then in his personal life was very much into spiritualism. And I tried to touch on that a little bit in the story, where he has these dreams, these visions, which kind of foretell what's going to happen later in the story.
It's very much so. And of course, the spiritualism aspect of him got him a lot of mockery. He was mocked mercilessly in this. And of course, the famous, was it the Cottingley Fairies episode, where he looked at the photographs and implicitly believed in it. But to me, it's just, I just think he was such a gentleman. I mean, I think he was a big man. He was certainly a sporty man, certainly in his youth. But also, I think he was, a gentleman and a gentleman. I just think he was very honourable, and even to his dying day, he used to take a rose that he used to take into his wife. He used to go and pick a rose from the garden and take the rose, and even on the day he died, he did that. Took the rose into his wife, such a romantic man, and he creates this, if you like, this character who. I won't say doesn't have empathy for other people, but certainly sees other people as intellectually beneath him to an extent, Sherlock Holmes. But one of the interesting that I did want to ask you, and that's just reminded me of it now, is, of course, lately there's been, with Jack the Ripper, the big game is always, let's name Jack the Ripper. Who was Jack the Ripper? And of course, lately, Conan Doyle has come up as being a suspect for being Jack the Ripper.
I hadn't heard that.
Apparently, he's been named as a possible suspect. As with so many of these now, there's very little evidence for it. But what do you think of that, of Conan Doyle being Jack the Ripper?
Oh, he was far too busy with his practice, down south, and between his medical practice and his writing, and that just doesn't fit his personality whatsoever. He always saw himself as a champion of justice. I remember the case of George Elijah, the Anglo-Indian barrister that he defended against animal mutilation. He fought very hard to get the man's name cleared, and he was removed from the practice of law, and Doyle got him reinstated. And he said when he first met the man, he knew immediately that he was innocent because the thickness of the man's glasses. Having been an eye surgeon, I mean, he noticed that right away, that this man was almost legally blind. And he said there's no way that man could have gone out into the darkness and mutilated these animals with his poor eyesight. So he knew instantly that the man had to be not guilty.
It's incredible. It really is an incredible and an incredible life as well. But so you've got the three characters. You've got Conan Doyle, you've got Joseph Bell, and you've got Margaret Harkness. I'm going to put you on the spot now, Bradley. Of the three, who is your favourite? You weren't expecting that one, were you?
No, I wasn't. That's not quite fair.
It's not fair, is it? It's not fair. I know it's not fair, but humour me.
Okay, of the three, who would I like to spend the most time to have dinner with? I think Margaret Harkness. She is a woman that I really admire. She reminds me of my own mother. My mother was the first woman at her university to graduate with a degree in mathematics, and she had to fight for that. She had to also major in English because her advisor said there were no jobs for female mathematicians. And so she had to have a double major so that she could pursue her true love of mathematics. And my mother was always very strong-willed. In Oklahoma at the time, when I was a child, female teachers got paid 60% of what male teachers were being paid. So every Friday she'd come home and have a strong drink. Payday, But yeah, so there's a bit of my mom in there. In fact, she was my first editor, and I gave her an early draft of my manuscript, and I got it back about a week later, all marked up in red. And she looked at me. She said, "Son," she said, didn't I teach you anything? And I said, yes, Mom. I said, you taught me to love the written word.
That's it's funny that, isn't it? How mothers can be such an influence on you in that respect. I always remember my mother. She and I've still actually got it on my bookshelf somewhere. When I was, I think, 7, she bought me a copy of Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare, and it was just by Charles and Mary Lamb, and it was just Shakespeare's plays with the naughty bits cut out so that children could read them. And it's, for many people of a certain age, that was their introduction to Shakespeare. But I think my mother was the one, who she was a teacher, and so she was, and funnily enough, she was my teacher for several years as well. And my mother used to mark me. She was merciless to me because she didn't want to be accused of showing favoritism to her own child. And so I always felt I was being picked on, and she would do the same to me. Just tear everything apart that I wrote. But I think in some ways it's good for us, because I think we, as authors, we need to learn a little bit of humility, and we have to take the knocks before we can go forward with the good stuff.
Very much so. I've had a few aspiring writers ask me for advice, and one of the first things I said is, you're going to get a lot of rejection. It doesn't matter who you are. One of my favorite books on writing is by Stephen King, and the first half of the book is basically how he became a published author. All the rejection he had, all the heartaches. At one point, he had his car was broken, and his child had a fever 102. And he had to decide, do I take my child in to see the doctor, or do I have my car fixed so I can go to work on Monday? I mean, that's how hard off it was. And I wondered at the time, why does he spend, and then he gets to some very good advice on writing. But I really wondered initially why he spent so much time on his own little story, if you will, memoir of his journey as a writer, before he got to the practical advice. And after I've been at it for a while, I realized he was trying to tell anyone who wanted to be a writer is, everyone gets rejected. You know, he did, Stephen King did, who's now one of the best-selling writers who ever lived, and he was just saying that I don't care who you are, you're going to get, no matter how well you write, you're going to get rejections. And my books have done well, but I've had some pretty scathing reviews as well. And I realized one day, I says, there's I don't know, I think maybe 2,000 words in the English dictionary invented. None of those belong to me. I'm borrowing all those words. I'm arranging them for an effect. I'm going to do the best job that I can to convey my vision, what's in my brain, and hopefully lodging it into the readers. But at the end of the day, I don't own those words. And if someone doesn't like my arrangement, as I used to tell my girls, that's why they make more than one flavor of ice cream.
Well, that's a great way to look at it, and it's because I mean, as an author, because being an author, it's almost like you're giving over part of you as well. So I think the rejection can be a real hurtful thing. One thing I always found was, is the editing stage when it goes to the book editor, because you've written those words. And of course, editors, by their nature, they have to be merciless, and they just they will tear that work apart. And that's what and they'll ask you to, what do you mean by this? What are you trying to say here? Of course, you think, hang on, it's obvious what I'm trying to say. And I think you do have to get an awful lot of humility as an author. So I think it really is. It's not all glamour. And for every J.K. Rowling, there's probably sort of a million. There's probably far better writers than J.K. Rowling who just haven't got the recognition. It's very much a labour of love, and I don't think anyone ever writes a book to get rich.
Well, I don't think so. I had the very good fortune of having a little sit down with a very better author than myself, David Baldacci. He's from Virginia, and I was at a bookstore event where he was there, and he was very kind to me, and we talked for a little bit, and he said, never read your reviews. He said the bad ones will make you doubt yourself, and the good ones will make you careless.
Well, this is it. I always remember the Charles Dickens story with Hans Christian Andersen. When Hans Christian Andersen came to stay with Charles Dickens, and Charles Dickens found him crying in his garden one day, and he went out and said, "What on earth's the matter?" And he said, he'd got a bad review and he'd read the bad review. And Dickens said to him, "Oh, you do not want to do that. Do not read your reviews." And Dickens always swore blind that he never read his reviews. I suspect he probably did. And I think the bad reviews, and I think the worst thing about it well, I suppose for anybody really, is you might get 20 fantastic reviews, but the one that you'll remember the longest will be the one bad review of the 20. And I think I once got a review from somebody who said it was about a book of ghost stories, and said, this is a fantastic book for a winter's night. Pull a chair close to the fire and throw the book on the fire. And I mean, looking back on it now, I'm quite proud of that review.
Well, you've certainly grown a lot. Good for you. Good for you. I respect you even more.
Well, I could just see the critic writing that, or sitting down to write that, and then thinking, and I bet that person was so proud of that one. And of course, if you think about it, it's a really good line, actually. So I think, but no, it can be very hurtful. And of course, you when we first got in touch with it, or when we first spoke and started emailing each other, you were very philosophical about the rejections you were getting. Because I can remember you saying, "Well, I've had this rejection, that rejection," and it was almost you were expecting them, and then, of course, when it came along and you got the acceptance, how did that feel?
It was unbelievably. I couldn't grasp that someone had finally said yes. I was philosophical. I did not believe in myself, but I believed in my characters and I believed in my story. I said, there's a very, very good story here. Now, I'm more than willing to let someone who's more experienced guide me on how to unearth that, to draw it out. But I had this vision of what the story would be about, and Doyle's voice was in my head, and I trusted Doyle. He's not going to lead me astray. He's going to help me tell a good story if I just trust him. If I confide in him, if I'm vulnerable, if I'm open, Conan Doyle will in the end, he will pull me through, and he did.
And he did. He got the, and it's such a wonderful read, and it really does capture Victorian London, and the way it captures London, and I think the characters as well. I mean, it's lovely to see Aberline turn it. But as I said at the start, Margaret Harkness turn. I think it's just so fantastic that you have Margaret Harkness in there as well. So I think you've done her proud, and I think she'd be grateful for that.
Oh, I hope so. She's a fascinating woman. I wanted to do a third book about her time in Australia. But unfortunately, the first book did very well. My second book, Queen's Gambit, unfortunately hasn't made much of a ripple. So my publisher has let me go. So working on the third book now, and I've got Margaret on board the Titanic. She's been hired as a Pinkerton agent, and there was a group of all female thieves they had two names. They're called the 40 Thieves, also called the 40 Elephants. They operated out of a pub called the Castle and Elephant in South London. And this gang existed from around 1780 to 1950. And during the time of the Titanic, the queen of the 40 Thieves was a woman named Alice Diamond. She was 5'8", and she wore rings on all the fingers of her hands. It was said she could knock a man out with one punch. And this is when
I've met her.
And this is when most men were around 5'6". So she was, quite a bit taller than most men, and yet she could play a very sophisticated woman of the upper class. And so she and a couple of associates are on the Titanic to fleece the wealthy passengers. And Margaret has been hired as a reserve Pinkerton agent to try to. They don't know exactly who. The rumor is that there are some thieves on board to try to rob, to fleece the wealthy passengers. And some of the richest people in the world were on that inaugural cruise of the Titanic, so that's realistic. And her supervising agent is a young man named Harry Worth. His father was Adam Worth, who was the real-life inspiration for Professor Moriarty. Now, Adam Worth, in his latter years, was in prison for some time, got out in poor health, and he sold to Alan Pinkerton a very famous painting that he'd stolen on three conditions. One, for $25,000. Two, that he would not be prosecuted. And three, that when Harry, his son, reached his majority, Alan Pinkerton would make him a Pinkerton agent. He didn't want his son to follow in his own footsteps. And Pinkerton admired Worth very much because he never used violence. He said a man with brains never should have to resort to violence. And so he agreed to those terms. So I've got the son of the real life Professor Moriarty, Margaret Harkness, taking on the Alice Diamond and the 40 Thieves on board the Titanic.
Fantastic. And the painting you're talking about, the Adam Worth, was that the Duchess of Devonshire?
Or? It was indeed.
Yeah,
it was indeed.
And of course, that links back to the Ripper, because Chief Inspector Swanson, who was the one who assessed all the information, it was his sworn job was to get that portrait back. It was one of the cases he was fascinated about as well. It was a case he wanted to solve, truly solve it. So it's fantastic. So dare I ask on the time, or now this might be a spoiler. I was going to ask you which ones of them go down with the Titanic. that might spoil the entire storyline.
Although there was a very famous painting on board the Titanic as well, life-size picture of a Circassian woman coming out of the bath, painted by the French artist Blondel. And the Titanic, the White Star Company had to settle a $25,000 claim against it when it went down with the ship. And that's one of the things the thieves are going to try to steal.
Do you know, the Titanic is, I never tire of documentaries on the Titanic. It's a TV producer once told me that there's two things you can guarantee. There's three things you can guarantee to sell to the History Channel. One of them is anything about Nazi Germany. You can sell, but the other two are the Titanic and Jack the Ripper. There'll always be demand for documentaries on Titanic and Jack the Ripper. And of course, if you could, and of course, you can link the two, because W.T. Stead, who was the editor of the Pall Mall Gazette and so critical of the police's investigation, of course, he went down on the Titanic. So in a way, there is a way of linking Jack the Ripper to the Titanic. But I never tire of it, and I find it so eerie when those ones where the submarine goes down and just. You see, and as it comes through the darkness, and suddenly there's the Titanic, and it's because as a child, I mean, it hadn't been discovered; it was somewhere sunk deep. And when I was a child, it hadn't been discovered then, and it was just sort of thing. You thought, well, we'll never find out anything about it, and then suddenly you can look at this thing that was such an iconic part of childhood days and everything. So now I think it's going to be a wonderful story. Have you started on it, or?
I have, yes. I've got my characters on board the ship. I have Margaret and the agent board the day before because they're under contract with White Star Line. So they're getting a tour of the ship and trying to do credit to the luxurious nature of the Titanic is a real challenge. So I'm taking them on the tour right now. So I'm into my 5th chapter in the book, and so it's a work, and very much a work in progress, but I hope to have a first draft complete by October, and then put it aside for about a month, and then pick it up again and start refining the story. But that's where I'm at right now.
So I must ask, for A Knife in the Fog, you made a point of paying a visit to London. Are you going to pay a visit to the Titanic?
No, unfortunately, I do not have to do that. I live in Southeast Virginia, and there's quite a large maritime presence here. And there's a Mariners Museum about 30 miles from where I live. And I'm in contact now with a curator there who's quite an expert on the Titanic, and she's helping me. Of course, I'm doing my own research as well, but she kind of double checks what I write, and she's reviewing my descriptions and making sure I get things right. And so I was planning to go to Belfast, and there's a very wonderful museum there, but again, in the current circumstances, maybe in the fall after I've done the first draft, I could go and visit. I would like to do some more research than what I've been able to do at the moment. On the second book, it's about an imaginary assassination of Queen Victoria during the Diamond Jubilee. And you showed me, or you told me, where I could find the plaque where the carriage rested. And I found the window where I would put my sniper and visited that building and looked out the window and took some pictures. So the final scene of the confrontation, if you will, is very descriptive because it's based on this actual place that was just the perfect site for the sniper to be.
That's because this is the thing about Jack the Ripper. Nowadays, when we think back on it, we simply think of just Jack the Ripper. And it's almost as though that's the only case the Victorian police had to deal with. But of course, they had, it was a moving kaleidoscope. There were so many things going on. And of course, London at the time was suffering terrorist attacks, Fenian outrages, bombs being let off. And the year before, as you say, 1887, there had been a plot to assassinate not just Queen Victoria, but also the cabinet, members of the family, and the European heads of state. And in fact, it had been thwarted by, you make mention of Section D in your book, the Special Secret Section, but they were the ones who thwarted them. And of course, in charge of that, or the man who did it, was James Monroe. And James Monroe becoming the Metropolitan Police Commissioner after the retirement of Sir Charles Warren. But Monroe, when he went into Westminster, he was invited to Westminster Abbey to celebrate Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee service. And he wouldn't take his family because he was still convinced that somebody might have got something into the Abbey. And so he said he sat there during the entire service, just waiting for something to go off during the service. And he sat there just praying that nothing would happen, but he wouldn't allow his family to go. And it's I think we tend to get distracted by Jack the Ripper to the bigger picture of history. But it's such a wonderful, well, not wonderful, but there's just so much fascination. And I think you're right with the Victorian period and going up to 19. You've got this fantastic inspiration for any writer, and to actually draw on that well. I think you've done a fantastic job in A Knife in the Fog.
Thank you so much. Talking about police commissioners, in my second book, I mention Bradford. Fascinating gentleman. One-armed.
Yep.
Lost his left arm to a tigress while serving in India. Was still able to have a full military career. In fact, he used to hunt wild boar on horseback. And it said that when he needed to use his lance, he would put the reins in his. So I say, rule Britannia.
Well, I think, looking back, with Bradford, and that the whole period of all these commissioners. Of course, the one who gets the worst rap is perhaps Sir Charles Warren, and of course he was the commissioner. Well, the commissioner the commissioner for all the Jack the Ripper murders, not the Whitechapel murders, because he resigned after Mary Kelly's murder. Do you think that Sir Charles, being a military man yourself, Sir Charles Warren, of course, famously was a military man. Do you think he was too militarized to actually look at new methods of detection, new ways of catching the Ripper? Do you think that the force might have benefited from having a different commissioner as opposed to a military commissioner?
Well, Bradford was also, of course, had a long military career, and he revolutionized the force. He had them start rotating shifts so they wouldn't get bored. Came up with a summer uniform. He connected all the stations with telegraphs, built some new stations, and during his tenure visited every single station at one time or the other, and really modernized the Metropolitan Police Force. So when he took over, the morale was very low. The esteem of the Metropolitan Police was at its lowest. And some 8 years later, by the time of Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, London celebrated its lowest crime rate in history.
And that's I do find that the police interesting at the time, because it's often said, well, you get a lot of people saying, well, the police, they weren't incompetent, but in fact, it surprised me when I started delving into it how many unsolved cases there actually were by 1888. And of course, I suppose you can't really lay that 100% at the police's door, because of course they're dealing with a killer who, by the very nature, they're not known to the victim. There's nothing that connects them to the victim. So they can't look at the usual suspects. It was a spouse murder or somebody they knew. So basically, do you agree that the police literally just had to hope for a lucky break? And if that break came, they would have caught him, but it didn't come, so they didn't catch him.
I would quite agree with that. They had no formal training whatsoever. Just, in fact, a lot of them didn't really understand what they legally could and couldn't do. The Ripper should have been caught because of the risk that he took. And one of the things I tried to put in the book that struck me was the density of the human population in the East End. At the time, I was able to find the 1890 census, and the average population per acre in rural England was about 25 people per acre. In the West End, it was about 50 people per acre. And in the East End, in the Whitechapel area, it was 800 people per acre. And to be able to do those crimes in alleyways and courtyards, and it's such densely packed humanity, just even now, I find that difficult to understand how someone could have done that and nobody see anything.
It is very strange, because it almost creates this mythical character that he could actually commit those murders and get away with it. And of course, he's been mythologized ever since, to the extent, and I think there's been an extent where he could have even been glorified. And what I liked about what you did was that you made the victims. He wasn't the hero; the victims were the heroines, and the victims were they came up through this the horrible lives that they'd led. Because that's one of the things about Jack the Ripper's victims, is that they weren't. They fell through the net. It was a period, we were talking about humanity earlier on, but this was a period where there was no safety net. These ladies had become alcoholics. They'd separated from their spouses. They ended up in the East End of London, which was the Skid Row of the Victorian metropolis, and there was nothing to save them. If you fell through that net, that's where you ended up, and you had to do anything you could to survive, which is why I don't like the term prostitute, often used to describe, because I prefer, which I think is a much fairer term, is the Victorian term, unfortunates, because I think that really does sum up what these women were. And I think you do. There's a lot of sentiment towards them, towards the victims in A Knife in the Fog.
Thank you very much. And one of the complicating factors is, of course, venereal disease was an occupational hazard, and it was believed at the time that alcohol was protective against venereal disease. And so you might say that gave them an occupational reason to imbibe regularly.
Well, this is it, and it's and of course that's the other point about the area, was drunkenness was commonplace in the area, and drunken brawls were common in the area, and of course a cry of murder, because when people got into fights in those days, it was quite common for someone to cry out murder, murder. It didn't mean anyone was being murdered. It just meant that it was something people shouted out when something got out of hand. And of course, we do have, certainly with Mary Kelly, that two of the neighbours possibly heard a very faint cry of murder or murder at the time the murder, but because they were so used to it, the cry, they ignored it and went back to sleep. So it's and again, it's almost as though the Ripper chose the area deliberately. It was the perfect area, densely populated, and a population that didn't really want to have anything to do with the police as well. And as I say, but then you send Conan Doyle, Joseph Bell, and Margaret Harkness into the area, and I do think it's an excellent book. It's a great read, and I almost feel that I've been in there from in there with you, listening.
Well, you were with me from the very start when I was still doing my research, when it was still just an idea in my head, and I had a very, very rough first couple of drafts, and I emailed you and asked you for some advice and some information, and you were always very kind to me. So you've really been with me from the very start. You've been sort of my torch in the darkness, if you will. You kind of, truly, I owe you a great debt.
Oh, thank you.
And just some late breaking news this week, I will get a treatment from a screenwriter in Hollywood who's written for a couple of television shows, and he's working on a treatment of the book to make it to a short run television series. I don't know how many episodes he's looking at, but like I said, he's got he has contacts in the industry. He's had shows that have been produced in the past, and so things are looking very promising. And right now, getting something produced on television is a lot easier than it is making it on the large screen. And one of the things that the screenwriter said, in a limited series like this, he said he really likes my characters, and he said he can really flesh them out in more detail over a series of television episodes than he could in a big screen project. And so I can't imagine me saying no, but nothing will happen until I've reviewed everything. And if I say yes, I agree, then he'll start pitching it to some producers in Hollywood, and we'll see what happens.
That's going to be fantastic. And how do you think you'll feel let's say when that day comes when you sit down and you watch your characters on the screen? How's that going to feel?
It's going to be amazing. I was very fortunate on the book. My agent was able to sell the audio rights, and the narrator, Mr. Davies, formerly with the Royal Shakespeare Company. When I first heard my words voiced by a professional actor, that was just a sense of awe fell over me. I wasn't sure I was really awake at the time. It was just these people who lived in my head. I think I wrote a good book, but he didn't read the book. He performed it, and his performance really brought them to life, and I think took my story and raised it another level at least. And I was just awestruck at what a great actor could do with the story that I had written. And so if I can have that experience now even on a small screen, that would still be amazing. Those would be my characters, may not be all my words, but at least based upon the story that you helped me to fashion so many years ago. And so it'll be another amazing thrill. When I got my first box of my books and I opened up the box, I had the great privilege of delivering both my own daughters. By the way, my wife said, finish what you started. But I opened up the box the first time that had my books in, and I brought the books out in my hand. I felt like I was delivering my third.
There's no better feeling than when people ask me, they say, "What's the best thing about writing?" Because writing it's a very lonely thing to do. You're living with these characters, but it is very lonely. And to me, I always say that there's several big thrill moments. The first thrill moment is when you put that last full stop in, and you write the end. That's a feeling because you've accomplished it. It's completed. I say the next best feeling is when the page proofs come back to you, and you see the page proofs, and then the best feeling of all is when that box of books arrives. And actually, there's a fourth one as well, and that's when you go into a bookshop and you see it. See it on a bookshop, and there it is on the bookshop shelves, and then you watch somebody take the book off the shelf and flick through it, and you're almost hanging on, going, "Are they going to buy? Are they going to buy it?" And you almost want to step in and say, "If you buy it, I'll sign it."
Oh, well, as a matter of fact, Knife in the Fog is now available in Japanese.
Oh, fantastic.
Yes, we sold the rights to Hayakawa Publishing because it was a finalist for the Edgar Award for Best First Novel, and Hayakawa typically buys Edgar finalists. And so I'm waiting for my box in Japanese.
And then
I get 10 free Japanese books. I don't know what I'll do with them, but I'll keep at least one of them.
Well, it's fantastic. I always found I think I've had I don't think I've made Japanese. I've been in German, Dutch, Danish, and French as well.
Right.
And it doesn't mean anything to me when I say, but it's It could be anything in that book, but it's just a great feeling, isn't it, to see your work in another language, and it's on there. But one thing I was going to ask you, which we digressed for a moment there, but going back to this, the screen working of when it appears on the small screen. So I've got to ask you, who would be your dream actor to play the three characters, Conan Doyle, Joseph Bell, and Margaret Harkness? Who would be your dream actors and actress to play those three?
Well, the easiest for Margaret, I would like for Emma Watson to play Margaret. I think she would be the perfect Margaret. She's the right age, the right build, and the right spirit.
Yeah.
I think she would do a marvelous job. I think because Joseph Bell is such a Scottish icon, I would really want a Scottish actor to portray him. Now, he was a rather slight man, but even so, I'd like for Liam Neeson to portray him, although he's much taller than the actual Bell. But again, I think a Scottish actor should play a man who's such a Scottish hero. The third Doyle, that's the hardest one, because Doyle was over 6 feet tall. He was a large man, especially, and I said in those days the average height was around 5'6", and he was still like late 20s. And I just don't know, and I think it should be a British actor. I would not want an American actor to portray him. But I don't know who the candidates would be, but it needs to be someone who physically has the physicality that Doyle had, and I think out of deference to this great icon of literature in the English language, I think an Englishman would have to be someone British to play that role. I just don't think it would be fair to do it with any other nationality.
Fantastic, and just the excitement that I can almost feel it for you now of actually sitting down there. Would you have a family party? Would you all sit around for a screening?
Oh yes. I suppose I don't know what they do, and it's not like you have when a movie comes out, they have the grand premiere or whatever. I don't know what they do for a TV series, but hopefully by then we can all go to a pub together or something and celebrate. But we will certainly have a mighty celebration if and when that happens. And my agent will be invited. Her reader who recommended the book to her would be invited as well. So there's some people who have helped me along the way that would all be invited, and we will have a good time.
They're fantastic. You should do sort of a Zoom mass watch of it, so everybody the world over can watch it.
Great idea. Thank you.
Anyway, well, it's been great talking to you. So I think so the book we've been discussing to begin with was Knife in the Fog, which I'll hold up again there. So Bradley Harper, A Knife in the Fog. And I've got to show you, there's something else I have to show you as well that I'll tell you about it. It's that bit there. See, I've got a personally signed copy in there for me. So that's my personally signed copy of Knife in the Fog. But Bradley, it's been fantastic seeing you again, talking to you again. And good luck with the project. And I can't wait to see Knife in the Fog on the TV and to see who plays who in that novel.